The forest breathed around Sarah Miller, its ancient pines standing sentinel against the gray winter sky. Her weathered hands gripped the binoculars, scanning the snow-dusted landscape with practiced precision. At 47, she knew these woods like the lines etched on her face. Each curve, each hidden path, a memory of years spent protecting this wilderness. A chill wind whispered through the branches, carrying memories as sharp and cold as the approaching storm. Sarah's mind drifted to her father, Dr. James Miller, the wildlife biologist who had first ignited her passion for conservation. She could still hear his voice, rough yet gentle, teaching her to respect the delicate balance of nature. "Every creature has a story," he would say, "and it's our job to listen." Those words echoed in her mind as she adjusted the radio clipped to her heavy winter jacket. The weather report confirmed what her instincts already knew: a massive storm was brewing. The forest ranger's training kicked in immediately. Years of experience had taught her that survival in these woods meant preparation and respect. Sarah methodically began securing her equipment. Her small ranger station, more a sturdy cabin than an office, became a hub of organized chaos. Maps were rolled and secured, emergency supplies checked and double-checked. Each movement was deliberate, a dance of survival she had perfected over 2 decades of forest service. The personal photographs on her wall told a different story, one of loss and dedication. A younger Sarah stood beside her father, both smiling after a successful wildlife study. Another showed her graduating from forestry school, a moment of pride quickly overshadowed by the tragedy that followed. The loss of her father to a wilderness accident had transformed her grief into a fierce commitment to conservation. As the first snowflakes began to fall, Sarah completed her preparations. The storm wasn't just approaching. It was charging like an angry beast, ready to consume everything in its path. She checked her emergency radio, satellite phone, and survival kit one last time. A sudden movement caught her eye. Through the swirling snow, a massive shadow moved between the trees, too large to be a deer, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. Sarah's heart raced. Her years of experience told her this was no ordinary forest creature. Something was out there, injured perhaps, vulnerable. The wind howled, drowning out all other sounds. Sarah pulled on her heaviest coat, checked her emergency flares, and prepared to investigate. Whatever was moving out there needed help, and in these woods, she was the only hope. As the storm intensified, visibility dropped to mere feet. The forest, usually so familiar, became a white maze of potential danger. Sarah moved carefully, her trained eyes searching for any sign of the creature she had glimpsed. Her radio crackled with a final warning from base. "Storm warning in effect. Seek immediate shelter. Repeat, seek immediate shelter." But Sarah Miller had never been one to abandon something or someone in need. The shadow had awakened something deep within her, a sense of purpose, a calling that went beyond mere duty. The storm raged around her, a white fury that threatened to consume everything. But Sarah stood firm, a solitary figure against nature's might, determined to uncover the mystery of the shadow in the woods. The storm's fury had subsided, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Pristine white snow blanketed the forest floor, muffling every sound except the occasional crack of ice-laden branches. Sarah Miller emerged from her ranger station, her breath forming delicate frost clouds in the crisp morning air. Her keen eyes scanned the wilderness, searching for any sign of the shadow she had glimpsed during the night's tempest. Her boots crunched through the fresh snow, each step deliberate and measured. Years of ranger experience had taught her to read the forest's subtle language, the bent branches, the disturbed snow, the faint tracks that told stories of survival. Something was out there, wounded and hiding. A low, almost imperceptible growl caught her attention. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the medical kit attached to her belt. The sound came from a narrow opening between 2 massive rock formations, a cave partially hidden by snow-covered evergreens. "Easy now," she whispered, more to herself than anything else. Her father's lessons echoed in her mind. Respect, patience, and understanding were the keys to approaching wounded wildlife. As she drew closer, she saw him, Bruno. A massive bear, his fur matted with blood and snow, his powerful body curled defensively in the cave's shadows. His eyes, a mix of pain and wariness, locked onto Sarah. Years of poaching attempts had taught him to fear humans, to see them as nothing more than threats. Sarah's heart ached. She recognized the signs of recent injury, a jagged wound along his side, likely from a hunter's careless shot or a desperate escape. Her professional training kicked in, but something deeper stirred within her, a compassion born from years of witnessing nature's fragile balance. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, her voice calm and steady. She slowly reached into her pack, pulling out a package of dried meat. The movement was deliberate, non-threatening. "You're hurt. I want to help." Bruno's response was a low warning growl, a sound that would have terrified most. But Sarah saw beyond the aggression. She saw fear, pain, and a desperate will to survive. She remembered her father's words, "Every creature has a story, Sarah. Our job is to listen." She placed the meat on a nearby rock, then took a few steps back. Distance, respect, trust. Minutes passed. The forest held its breath. Then cautiously, Bruno's nose twitched. The scent of food was compelling, stronger than his fear. Inch by painful inch, he moved toward the offering. Sarah watched, her heart racing. This was more than a rescue. This was a delicate dance of survival and trust. Each movement was a negotiation, each moment a potential breakthrough or setback. When Bruno finally reached the meat, Sarah noticed how carefully he moved. The wound was serious, likely limiting his mobility and making survival in the harsh winter nearly impossible. Survival in these conditions alone would be a death sentence. "We're going to get you healed," she whispered, more a promise to herself than to Bruno. The bear paused, a piece of meat halfway to his mouth. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Something passed between them, a recognition, not of species, but of shared vulnerability, of survival. As the day progressed, Sarah maintained a careful distance. She knew trust couldn't be rushed. She prepared additional supplies, antiseptic, bandages, more food. Her ranger training merged with a deeply personal commitment to healing. Bruno, for his part, alternated between wariness and exhaustion. Each time Sarah moved, he would tense, but each time she remained calm, he would slowly relax. The first step of an extraordinary journey had begun. A forest ranger and an injured bear, brought together by a storm, survival, and an unexpected connection that defied the usual boundaries between human and wild. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, witnessing the beginning of an unlikely friendship. The morning light filtered through the snow-laden branches, casting a soft, diffused glow across the makeshift shelter Sarah had constructed. Her fingers, slightly numb from the cold, carefully cleaned and rebandaged Bruno's wound. The bear lay still, his breathing steady but cautious, a testament to the delicate trust they had begun to build. "We need to find food," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Bruno. The winter wilderness was unforgiving, and survival meant constant vigilance. She remembered her father's lessons about forest survival, how to read the landscape, identify edible plants, and track potential food sources. Bruno's ears perked up, tracking her movements. His dark eyes, once filled with fear and mistrust, now held a glimmer of understanding. Sarah had spent the past day carefully approaching him, speaking in soft tones, moving slowly to demonstrate she meant no harm. "I know you're hungry," she said, rummaging through her pack. She pulled out some dried meat, emergency rations she always carried. Breaking it into smaller pieces, she placed them carefully near Bruno, maintaining a respectful distance. The bear hesitated, then cautiously approached the food. His movements were still guarded, but less defensive than before. As he ate, Sarah shared stories about her childhood, her father's work, her commitment to the forest. It was a one-sided conversation, but somehow therapeutic for her. "I've spent so much of my life alone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Always protecting, always watching, but never really connecting." Bruno looked up, meeting her gaze. There was something in his eyes, a recognition perhaps of shared loneliness. The peace was suddenly shattered by a distant howl. Wolves. Sarah tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at her belt. Bruno's entire body went rigid, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Easy," Sarah whispered, though she knew the danger was real. Wolf packs were territorial, and they would see both Sarah and Bruno as potential threats or prey. The howls grew closer. Sarah could hear the crunch of snow, the subtle movements of multiple predators circling their shelter. She began to construct a plan, using branches and her limited resources to create a defensive position. Bruno moved closer to her, his injured body now pressed protectively against her side. It was a remarkable moment of trust, the wounded bear positioning himself as a guardian despite his own vulnerability. The first wolf appeared, a large gray male, lean and hungry. More followed, their eyes fixed on Sarah and Bruno. Sarah knew they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered in traditional terms of survival. But survival, she had learned, was never just about strength. It was about adaptation, about understanding. She began to make herself appear larger, using techniques she'd learned from years of wildlife management. Simultaneously, Bruno let out a deep, resonant growl that seemed to shake the very trees around them. The wolves hesitated. One lunged forward, but Bruno was quicker. Despite his injury, he moved with a surprising agility, positioning himself between Sarah and the attacking wolf. Sarah grabbed a burning branch from their small fire, waving it menacingly. The combination of Bruno's fierce defense and Sarah's unexpected resistance confused the wolf pack. After a tense moment that felt like an eternity, the wolves began to retreat, melting back into the winter forest as quickly as they had appeared. When silence returned, Sarah looked at Bruno. The bear was breathing heavily, his wound reopened slightly from the exertion. She carefully approached, her hands gentle as she checked his injury. "We did it," she whispered, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. Bruno shifted, and for the first time, Sarah could have sworn he was returning her smile. As evening approached, Bruno moved closer to Sarah, seeking warmth. She draped a blanket over them both, her hand resting lightly on his fur. The forest around them was quiet, the snow continuing to fall softly, witnessing the extraordinary bond forming between a wounded bear and a solitary ranger. Their survival was no longer just about individual endurance, but about a shared journey of trust, protection, and unexpected companionship. The first rays of dawn crept through the dense forest, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Sarah stood near the entrance of their makeshift shelter, her keen ranger eyes scanning the surrounding wilderness. Bruno lay close by, his massive form alert despite the previous night's exhaustion. "Something's not right," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Bruno. Her intuition, honed by years of forest work, was sending warning signals. The unnatural silence, no bird calls, no rustling of small animals, spoke volumes. Bruno lifted his head, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Sarah recognized the sound not as a threat, but as a warning. Their weeks together had taught her to read the bear's body language, to understand the nuanced communication that existed between them. She knelt beside Bruno, her hand instinctively touching his shoulder. "Poachers," she murmured, reading the tension in his muscles. The word hung in the air like a threat. Their journey had been more than just survival. It had been a delicate dance of trust, of two beings from different worlds finding common ground. Bruno, once terrified of human tact, now looked to Sarah with a mixture of trust and protective instinct. Sarah began to methodically prepare. Her ranger training kicked in. She gathered their essential supplies, checked her emergency communication device, and prepared a series of defensive strategies. Bruno watched her, his intelligent eyes following her every move. "We're not going to be easy targets," Sarah said, her voice firm. She pulled out a series of tracking devices and small alarm systems she typically used for wildlife monitoring. Now, they would serve a different purpose. Bruno seemed to understand. As Sarah set up a perimeter of carefully placed sensors, he moved with her, occasionally nudging her hand or standing guard at strategic points. Their teamwork was intuitive, almost telepathic. The first sign of the poachers came as a distant snap of a twig. Sarah froze, her hand signaling Bruno to stay still. They had discussed, as much as a human and bear could discuss, their strategy. Bruno would be her early warning system, using his superior hearing and sense of smell. Two figures emerged from the tree line, rough-looking men carrying high-powered rifles. Their camouflage gear suggested they were experienced hunters, but Sarah knew the forest better than they ever could. "Now," she whispered to Bruno. The bear moved with surprising stealth for his size. Sarah had strategically placed several noise-making devices, small bells and wind chimes she typically used for wildlife research. As Bruno moved, these created calculated distractions, drawing the poachers' attention away from their true location. The hunters looked confused, their heads turning rapidly. "Did you hear that?" one muttered to the other. Sarah's plan was working perfectly. While Bruno created auditory diversions, she was systematically setting traps, not to harm but to impede. Rope snares designed to tangle, noisemakers to disorient, carefully placed barriers that would slow their movement. One poacher stepped into a carefully disguised tripwire. A loud crash echoed through the forest as he tumbled, his rifle sliding away. Bruno's strategic positioning had created the perfect moment of vulnerability. "What the hell?" the second poacher shouted, momentarily distracted by his companion's fall. In that moment of confusion, Sarah made her move. Using her ranger communication device, she simultaneously activated a series of wildlife preserve alarms and sent an emergency signal to the local forest ranger station. Bruno stood beside her, no longer the injured creature they'd first encountered. He was a protector now, his presence both intimidating and purposeful. The poachers realized too late that they were trapped. The sound of approaching ranger vehicles filled the air, their sirens cutting through the forest's morning silence. As law enforcement arrived, Sarah and Bruno watched from a safe distance. Their bond, forged through survival, trust, and mutual respect, was unbreakable. "We did it," Sarah whispered, scratching Bruno behind his ears. The bear leaned into her touch, a gesture that spoke volumes about their extraordinary connection. The forest around them seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Another threat had been neutralized, another piece of wilderness protected. Their journey was far from over, but in this moment, they were united. A forest ranger and a bear, an unlikely pair bound by something deeper than words could express.